Welcome to a ruined chapel by moonlight. I'm your host, Barefoot Gambler. Today we're reviewing Billy the Kid vs. Dracula. Since I'm talking about vampire fiction this month, it seemed right to include this review, which I originally published in 2019, of a weird Western film that claimed to pit one of the most famous outlaws of the American West against the legendary vampire. Go ahead, say that title out loud. Okay, maybe not if you're in a public place. Billy the Kid versus Dracula. The words seem intrinsically strange together, and become even more bizarre when you know that William Bonney, the famous outlaw known as Billy the Kid, was shot to death by Sheriff Pat Garrett in 1881, 16 years before Bram Stoker published his gothic novel of vampire horror, Dracula. Now it's true, Stoker's vampire was based on Vlad III Dracula, who lived in the 1400s. And thus, if he had been an immortal vampire, which most reliable historians seem to feel he wasn't, might have found his way into a showdown with the famous outlaw. But as the film begins, it quickly becomes clear that these details do not matter after all, because Billy the Kid isn't really Billy the Kid. The film apparently is set in some sort of alternate history in which Mr. Bonney abandoned his outlaw ways, did not run afoul of Sheriff Garrett, and instead became foreman at a ranch, where he is engaged to marry the young daughter of the ranch owner. Careful students of the craft of storytelling may here ask the question, why did the writer choose to tell a story about Billy the Kid in which Billy the Kid does not act like Billy the Kid, but somebody else altogether different? Careful students of the craft of storytelling are advised to take a stiff drink before going any further, because it is also worth noting that the vampire is not once referred to as Dracula throughout the entire film. So, it's Billy the Kid versus Dracula, except Billy the Kid isn't Billy the Kid, and Dracula isn't Dracula. All quite clear? Smashing! We proceed. The film begins with the vampire, played by John Carradine, who portrayed Dracula well in the surprisingly decent film House of Dracula, descending upon a family of German immigrants traveling by wagon in the American West. He bites the young daughter of the group, but is warded off at the sight of a crucifix. Later, the nameless vampire comes upon a stagecoach, carrying wealthy travelers towards their ranch, where he learns their beautiful niece Elizabeth resides. He is much taken with a picture of young Elizabeth shown to him by the travelers. When the coach stops for an evening, the vampire attacks a young Native American woman camped nearby, sparking the rage of the rest of the tribe. They assume it to be the work of the stagecoach's occupants and retaliate by killing them, allowing the vampire to assume the identity of the ranch owner and Elizabeth's uncle, Mr. Underhill. Meanwhile, William Bonney and young Elizabeth are playfully shooting tin cans and flirting with each other, much to the annoyance of the previous foreman, who watches jealously from afar. Apparently, being foreman also entails being Elizabeth's lover, since apparently Billy took both positions from him at the same time. Realizing that Elizabeth's uncle, Mr. Underhill, is due to arrive in town soon, Billy rides off to meet him at the saloon. He arrives just after the vampire, posing as Underhill, has come to the saloon and taken a room. Moments later, the immigrant family arrives, still shaken by the earlier vampire attack, and are horrified when their daughter recognizes Underhill as the vampire who attacked her. However, he is somehow able to convince them that he is not a vampire, and as a gesture of goodwill, allows them to take his room for the evening while he follows Billy to the Underhill ranch. But of course, this is all a diabolical trick, and the vampire returns that night to finish the job on the poor immigrant's daughter. Meanwhile, Billy and Elizabeth ponder the idea that there is something odd about her uncle, although what it is they can't quite put their fingers on. What could it be? So, after much riding back and forth, Billy getting into a brawl with the ex-foreman, and the old immigrant woman's attempt to keep the vampire away failing, Elizabeth is carried off into a makeshift lair the vampire has created in an abandoned mine. Billy rides there furiously, ignoring the town doctor's advice that to defeat the vampire he must drive a stake through his heart. Instead, in typical outlaw fashion, he tries to gun him down with his revolver, but the bullets have no effect. Okay, look. I know it's absurd to complain about logic in a film called Billy the Kid versus Dracula, but I can't help myself. Bullets are just fast moving miniature stakes, right? So why shouldn't they work on the vampire? Now, you might say, well, they didn't hit his heart, so it didn't work. I could buy that. Except that then Billy throws his gun at the vampire and hits him in the face and knocks him down. Seriously, what is this? If being hit with bullets didn't hurt him, why should being hit with a much slower moving hunk of metal? I know you all are thinking I'm being comic book guy at this point, but I have a reason for talking about this, and it's not because I'm one of those people who's going to go off and start a petition demanding that Billy the Kid vs. Dracula be remade with proper consultation of a period firearms expert and a close quarters combat specialist. The reason is because it's an important lesson for anyone who writes fiction. There are bound to be illogical things in any work of fiction. That's a given. If there weren't, it wouldn't be fiction. But the important thing is that the logic must be internally consistent. We get to make up our own rules for our fictional worlds, but they must never conflict with each other. All right, now, where was I? Oh, yes. So Billy then stabs the vampire through the heart with the doctor's stake and releases Elizabeth from the spell the creature placed on her. He then carries her out of the mine, in the words of Wikipedia, presumably to live happily ever after. I love that use of presumably. Like, we think they're going to live happily ever after, but who knows? It could be they'll realize that they're just two very different people who happen to get involved in this weird vampire business, gradually grow apart, and eventually come to the point where they argue over petty things like who should do the dishes before finally realizing that they need to go their separate ways. So we're 1,097 words into this review and you're wondering, Bertold, why are you even writing about this random, lousy 55-year-old movie? The reason is very simple. I'm fascinated by the weird Western genre. I like Westerns for the desolate desert landscapes and their frequent use of themes of loneliness and revenge. And of course, weird supernatural horror was my first love in fiction, and the combination of the two will always interest me. And so while I've made a huge amount of fun of the film, it's nonetheless, in its own odd way, significant as one of the first weird Western films. I mentioned the title at the beginning because I honestly think that a competent storyteller could make something interesting out of that. Make Billy the Kid be, honest to God, Billy the freaking Kid, the ruthless outlaw who boldly escaped from a New Mexico jail, and have him encounter a vampire while on the run from the law, somewhere in the gorgeous New Mexico landscape. A skilled writer could spin all kinds of compelling yarns about death, murder, and revenge out of that. But instead, we got a movie that shows a vampire strutting around in daylight. For shame. That's okay, though. They say that once you invite the vampire in, your fate is as good as sealed. And since early weird westerns invited the vampires west, it's paved the way for all sorts of interesting stories to follow.